Hello, everyone. Welcome very much to all of you for joining. We'll be officially starting momentarily. We're just letting folks in. So welcome to the iCON-VCH Indigenous Health Round. We have a very exciting round for you. So thank you so much for being here. Again, in about a minute, we'll officially start. We're just letting people in. So see you folks in a very short time. Hello, everybody. Happy Friday. Welcome to today's iCON-VCH Indigenous Health Round. I know that thanks to all of you for your sign up. I know that we have some old friends who've been joining us for a while. We also are welcoming some very new friends joining us for the first time. So welcome one and all. My name is Kendall Ho. I'm an emergency physician at Vancouver Coastal Health. Also professor at UBC Faculty of Medicine, and I'm the executive director of iCON. And really welcome you to this round, where today we have a very, very exciting topic and wonderful speakers to share with us so that we can all learn. First of all, I'd like to just acknowledge that I am calling in from this session is actually brought to you from the shared, unceded, ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I am a settler here in Vancouver, and I feel very, very fortunate to be here, to have this privilege of being here. For all of you, you're very welcome to do your land acknowledgements. I now welcome you. If you would like to do so through the chat, please feel free to put in the chat your land acknowledgements. And also looking forward to this round with you. I would like to start us off in the right mind frame. And I'm so glad that I have Elder Roberta Price here to be able to open our prayers for us so that before we go into the topic where Dr. Laurie Harding and also Dr. Linda Diffey will be speaking about this topic of anti-racism. Where do we start? Very important topic, really looking forward to that. But let me now invite Elder Roberta Price, who is a member of the Coast Salish people. She's an elder advisor and research partner at the University of British Columbia. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome her back to our health round today, just as she opened in our previous round. And let me pass it over to you, Elder Price.
OCM, thanks so much, Kendall. That's so lovely, warm introductions. And I shared this many, many times that when we pick up our sacred plants and we put on our full regalia, or parts of our regalia, as you've seen me put on my cedar headband, we're giving an indication to the ancestors and the creator that we're going to share some important words and perhaps share some ceremony. Thank you for listening to the ancestors. Start us off in a good and respectful way. Haichka Siem Siaya. Greetings and welcome, everyone. As Coast Salish matriarch and elder, I wish to give a very warm thank you to all my relatives on the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh for welcoming me to live in the unceded lands of my relatives, Musqueam, here in Richmond, going on 43 years now. As Coast Salish matriarch and elder, I wish to give each and every one a very warm welcome who live, work, and play, teach and learn, give and receive service on our unceded, ancestral, and occupied lands of my relatives, Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh. Always holding my hands up in honor and thanks to my beautiful mentor teaching elders. Elder Vince Stogan from Musqueam, Elder Bob George from Tsleil-Waututh, always follow in their mentoring footsteps and their teachings. Always share a blessing and a prayer whenever we come together. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to the teachings of our ancestors. Haichka, Haichka OCM, OCM. We give you many, many thanks, Creator, for bringing us all together here in this wide, wide virtual circle in such a warm and respectful way. We ask, Creator, that you bless anyone who's away due to illness or other obligations. Bless the ones who may yet to join us, help them to join safely. We call upon you, Creator, to bring your blessings down upon our minds, our hearts, our bodies, our spirits. So when we think our thoughts, they are good, positive, and respectful. When we speak our words, they are good, positive, and respectful. And we call upon you, Creator, to bless the people who prepare the food and drink. Bless the food and drink we put in to nourish our bodies on our journeys to wellness and strength. We give you kind thanks each and every day, Creator, for the special blessings of protection you bring down upon all the beautiful people who are working so very hard in so many ways in so many places during this pandemic, for all illnesses, for the safe delivery of our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and especially for the ongoing opioid crisis. Continue to bless and protect them and their families, Creator. And we kindly and respectfully ask you, Creator, to bring very special blessings of protection and healing down upon all our relatives right across Turtle Island who have continuing open wounds from all the media releases that are ongoing daily. Bless and protect all our relatives in health and healing, Creator. And we kindly and respectfully ask you, Creator, to bring very special blessings of protection and healing down upon all the beautiful people worldwide who are suffering the oppression in so many ways. Bless and protect them in health and healing, Creator. And we kindly and respectfully ask you, Creator, to wrap each and every one of us here and all of our loved ones in your warmest blanket of protection as we all continue on this part of our journey into 2023 and beyond. Help us each to keep safe in our travels, both near and far, Creator. And we always give you many, many thanks, Creator, as we ask you to bring all of your blessings down upon all the ones that are hurting, all the ones that are grieving, all the ones that are hungry, all the ones without home, especially, Creator, all the ones that are hurting, all the ones that are grieving. Haichka, Haichka OCM, awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. I pass my sacred bows over to back to you, Kendall. OCM, OCM.
Oh, sorry. I was talking on a muted phone. I should have learned better by now. I just want to thank you, Elder Roberta, for such a beautiful opening prayer. Thank you so much. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things before we get started. For this session, just as other sessions, we have been recording them. And the reason for that is some of you may have already revisited some of our previous sessions. These learnings are so important. We want to be able to share. And so if you've been notified before, and also just want to update you that the session will be recorded. It's no question that on behalf of our partners, BC Ministry of Health, Vancouver Coastal Health, Indigenous Health, Vancouver Physician Staff Association, and First Nations Health Authority, together with ourselves at UBC Faculty of Medicine, Department of Emergency Medicine, Intercultural Online Health Network, we welcome you all for this particular session. And so I'd like to now invite Leslie Blanchard, the lead of Vancouver Coastal Health, Indigenous Health, and VP of the VCH, to say a few words of welcome. Leslie, let me pass it over to you right now.
Thank you. I'll grab those virtual cedar boughs that Roberta just shared with you. Thank you, Elder Roberta, again for a beautiful opening. As Kendall mentioned, I'm Leslie Bonchor. I am Stalo and from the Shatton First Nation out in the Fraser Valley. Stalo territory, and also the Nooksack Indian tribe. And I just feel so blessed and honored to have worked with Kendall all these years, bringing these 1 hour little snippets of information to you folks. And I see that some people are enjoying some lunch and maybe off camera or trying to get a little nibble in and learn. And I thought, well, what a great way to just give another little teaching that I was taught. We always gathered around the kitchen table and we always share food. And when we're sharing food and when we're consuming our food while listening and learning, it stays with us longer. So please eat while you're learning, because it goes right into you and you can use it over and over again. So again, I want to encourage you all to not only enjoy this 1 hour session, come back to it when you need to, it'll be recorded so you can revisit it, but also please share it with your colleagues, friends, and family, because these 1 hour sessions are so informative and I just really find such value. And we've been doing them, I don't know for how long now, Kendall. We should count how many and maybe number them as we introduce them. It's an incredible format. And yeah, thank you. And I won't take up any more time. Have a great session, everyone. Thank you, Kendall, and all the partners, and Laurie and Linda. Thank you for doing what you do and sharing your wise words with everyone. Have a great day. Over to you, Kendall.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. We've been partnering on these rounds for 3.5 years. So it's just amazing. And I know that we start losing count of those years, but really what a pleasure to work with you and VCH, Indigenous Health. Thank you so much. Let me now invite Sherry Barr, again, a dear partner from BC Ministry of Health, who's been with us for a long journey in iCON, in fact, since 2017 on this journey. Sherry, let me hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Kendall, and also thank you, Elder Roberta. It was it's such a good way to start a meeting to get us grounded and feeling prepared to tackle a difficult topic. Thank you for the opportunity to provide an opening welcome. I'm Sherry Barr with Patients as Partners within Primary Care Division of the Ministry of Health. I would like to acknowledge and offer respect to the Lekwungen people on whose traditional territory I'm located on in Saanich, and to the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich people, whose historical relationships with this land continue to this day. I'd also like to acknowledge the Métis chartered community in this location. I'm a settler on this land and I'm very grateful to be here. My family had moved to escape war and other strife, and sadly this is continuing on now. So yes. In Patients as Partners, we believe that we can make the health system better when patients, their families, healthcare providers, and community partners work together. If you'd like to take a look and learn more about Patients as Partners, our website is patientsaspartners.ca. One of the things we offer is a calendar that describes free to patients educational events such as the one today and other events on multicultural chronic disease self-management. Patients as Partners has collaborated with and funded iCON for over 10 years, as we heard. And Dr. Kendall Ho has been the executive director for all of this time. And iCON has successfully brought together people for discussions such as the one today. However, as we saw in the In Plain Sight report, there's a lot more that we all need to do to eliminate racism in healthcare and achieve reconciliation. And I think today's presentation will be another step on that journey. So thank you very much to the organizers and the presenters, Dr. Laurie Harding and Dr. Linda Diffey. I very much appreciate your time and look forward to learning from you. And also thank you again to Roberta Price. It's very important, I think, to all hear each other's voices. Over to you, Kendall.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Let's jump right into the presentation with the anti-racism. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Laurie Harding and Dr. Linda Diffey. Dr. Harding is an author and an adjunct professor at UVic with extensive experience, University of Victoria, with extensive experience in facilitation education in Indigenous cultural safety and Indigenous anti-racism in the context of health and child welfare. She's co-author with Dr. Barry Lavallee in White Benevolence, Racism and Colonial Violence in the Helping Professions. So very glad to have Dr. Harding here. And also Dr. Linda Diffey is a member of the PPKISIS Cree Nation in the Treaty 4 region, an Indigenous scholar in the Community Health Sciences, and Win Indigenous Institute of Health and Healing. My apologies if I've mispronounced them. She's co-led the development and implementation of the Indigenous Health curriculum in the undergraduate medical education at the Max Rady College of Medicine, and served as a co-director of the National Undergraduate Medicine Curricular Framework for Indigenous Health. It's our distinct pleasure to have both of you here. We look forward to your conversations, and for our audience, at around 12:50, 12:55, we'll start to open up for Q&A. So there'll be lots of opportunity to provide questions and your comments. And as we move along, for our audience, if you can put your questions in the chat, I'll make sure that I'll revisit them and present them back to our speakers. Without further ado, Laurie and Linda, let me hand the time over to you.
Thank you. Laurie, did you want me to start?
Sure. And I think Ashley, do you want to do intro with a slide or on your own? All good.
Oh, either way. Ashley, if you want to start sharing the slides, I can start. Well, so thank you so much for the warm welcome from everyone, and particularly Elder Price for that wonderful opening to really, start us off in a good way. I think this is the first time I've had the opportunity to speak to anybody with affiliations to VCH, although I've been hearing about your work for years. So I'm very excited for the opportunity. As was mentioned in my bio at the beginning, I'm a member of the PPKISIS Cree Nation, and I'm really impressed at Kendall at how you were able to say it. Most people can't. And that's in the Treaty 4 region, which is in the Capel Valley area, and it's where my mother's family was from. I'm descended from 3 generations of residential school survivors on my mother's side. And on my father's side, he was non-status Algonquin with also British roots as well. I currently live in Treaty 1 territory and work at the University of Manitoba. I actually live just a stone's throw away from the historic Forks meeting of the Red and Assiniboine rivers, which has always been and continues to be a meeting place for Indigenous people here in this region. With that, I am going to, because I'm going to talk a bit about my work throughout this presentation, I will throw it over to Laurie.
Thanks so much, Linda, and thank you, Elder Price, for starting us off in such a good way. It does my heart good to start with a prayer and recognition and acknowledgement of where we are and who we are in relationship with Indigenous people doing this work of anti-racism. And introducing myself, I'm a white settler with Scottish and English colonial ancestry, and I occupy Cowichan territory, also colonially known as Shawnigan Lake over on Vancouver Island. I've been doing this work for a while, and I thank Dr. Diffey for the invitation to come and support the work at BRAID at the University of Manitoba. We both are Dr. Barry Lavallee mentees, and we met years ago. I came to Manitoba to see the Brian Sinclair report that Dr. Lavalley and a couple of his colleagues were bringing out the evidence and the information around that stark, brutal incident where Brian Sinclair was killed by negligence in a hospital. So that investigation and that investment was one of the beginning points for my interest in learning and the relationship that I had learning from Dr. Lavalley. And it's a pleasure to do this work and to take opportunity at any time to speak to what I've learned over the years. And I thank Leslie Bonshire for the invite to come and support the work at Vancouver Coastal Health. And Kendall, your organization and your team are bar none in putting this all together. So great big thank yous for the opportunity to speak to what we've learned and what we've been working on together in Braid. And looking at my own colonial identity and my land acknowledgement, I always recognize that who I am has a big part of the opportunities and advantages that I have as a settler person living and working on Indigenous land. And my own family background, we have 60 people in my family now. So I'm aware of that those benefits are growing every year with new additions to the family. I have a grandson who is 18 months and a granddaughter who's 3. So thinking about their realities and their experiences in contrast to Indigenous children today who are still being removed from homes when we know that families have the best opportunities to support their children in their growth and development. So thinking about that stark contrast, and also acknowledging in my background in education, the erasure and aversion to talking about race and racism. So the goal for me has been to go deeply, looking at what that means for me, what that means for people around me, wherever I am, and also reminding me why a land acknowledgement is necessary and an important part of Indigenous anti-racism development. And I think we'll go to the next slide there. And this slide. I'll briefly share this link, and I think people may be familiar with it and may have used it and be using it in their own learning and teaching. We start with this presentation today is about what we can do, and what we can do is acknowledge and learn about the Indigenous land that we live on. So for me, I think about my life in my lifetime, in my 63 years, I've learned that as a white settler, I benefit from Indigenous land wherever I have lived. And I was born on Dene territory and Cold Lake Band territory in 1959. And every place where I've lived, I can think of my benefit as the contrast to the Indigenous people who were living there at that time. So in 1959, we were on the air base, and I'm a twin, so we were the first twins being born on an air base, so they flew in 2 specialists. So I think about the Indigenous people who the First Nations moms were delivering babies, and they went to a different, smaller, much less staffed hospital where children were born. So, and then moving from there, we went to Ottawa, to Anishinaabe, Algonquin territory, and then Snuneymuxw, and then currently now in Quw'utsun territory. So one of the things we can do is to think about ourselves in that process of wherever we've lived, what was going on for our families and what was going on for Indigenous families if you're not Indigenous. So that contrast, so bringing the inequities into a relational experience is a part of that process. So I think of that not of working in health, and anyone who works in health and would know those disparities. It'd be a fundamental part of your work. And looking back on my own learning journey, I never learned that I was living on Indigenous territory. And I wonder how many people were taught that in their education throughout their years of school. So feel free to put your hand up if you did. If you did not, that would be very common. And that we weren't taught about Indigenous land growing up, and actually intentionally not taught that we were. So the propaganda of growing up on Indigenous land was to erase Indigenous sovereignty and to promote the nation state of Canada. So a part of that growth is about learning and actually unlearning colonial myths that racial difference is biologically defined, when in fact race is, we know, is socially constructed, and to maintain it's in place to maintain inequity, and that there are more biological differences between us, but within groups and between us. So we're going to look at the next slide is an activity, and we heard from Kendall that we have such a short period of time. We want to give you some snippets of what you can take away and do. And this is something that people can do with their teams. And so on this topic of a land acknowledgement and thinking about your relationship with Indigenous people on Indigenous land, you can journal. You can take that activity away, maybe bring it to a team meeting. Who are you? What is your ancestry? Whose Indigenous land do you live on? Have you lived on in your lifetime? And do the work of learning about what those inequities were in those spaces and places at that time. And then what that does is helps us to embody and recognize those realities over the years, and we can contrast the differences. So at the end, we can address what does that intrusion and occupation mean for us, for everyone. All of us here are needed to do something about that work. And it's so exciting to see the number of people that are here and that are interested in this work. And Tracy Underwood, who's a Wasanic matriarch at UVic, she's a professor there and a close friend. And she says we either disrupt or repair the relationship between original people and their land. So looking at the next slide, we talk about this, about the maybe lack or opportunity to speak to race and racism. And I know for myself, it wasn't something that I grew up comfortable learning about or talking about or looking into. And I remember as a child, my mother telling me that if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. And I knew intrinsically that to talk about race or even to identify race was not seen as not nice. And now I know that was effectively kept me from learning, looking, talking about, or even understanding racial differences. So it's been a lot of work to do that. And we want to respect the emotional process. And we have a page with a bunch of links and resources attached to it. And some of the resources that you may have access to are the Kuas First Nations Aboriginal Crisis Line. And that's available 24/7. And then also the Métis Crisis Line is available. The Indian Residential School Survivors Society, the FNHA has a wellness website. And I'd just like to acknowledge and recognize that these responses are different for people for differing reasons, depending on our identity. For white settlers like myself, we are learning about perhaps sometimes for the first time when we go into looking at the depth of harm that's happened to Indigenous peoples over the years of contact on Indigenous land. And then for Indigenous people, this is familial, relational, and those inequitable impacts are violent, harmful, and sometimes lethal. So we just want to acknowledge that, ask you to take care of yourself as we go through some of these discussions. We'll be talking about some of those challenging points and want you to know that we're here to speak to you after if you want to connect with us, and those other lines for support are available as well. We also like to note that anti-racism knowledge, self-awareness, and intervention skills are important. They're now recognized as imperative to providing safer services for Indigenous people and people of color, anyone who's not racialized as white, and that Indigenous anti-racism competency has been identified as a dangerous gap in post-secondary education. And now they're looking for standards, ways, and means to certify education and training. And as Leslie mentioned earlier, and or actually, I think it was Sherry who mentioned about the In Plain Sight report. we know that this is a huge issue, and it's something that we have to put on the table as often as we can to deal with. So we want to respect that emotional process in looking at that, and also recognize that unexamined and socially normed stereotypes about Indigenous peoples are dangerously harmful, in part contributing to inequities across all health measures today. And this is why there's been a need for systems to examine Indigenous specific racism, and also to provide education on anti-Indigenous racism as a strategy to address unique, pervasive, and intervention-resistant inequities. And that's a line I'm quoting from my thesis. You'll get that in a line, and I highly recommend anyone who's not Indigenous, especially white settlers, to read that methodology chapter. It's chapter 3, where I looked at myself and who I am in this work, and the investment for going where I was actually averted to wanting to look at, and finding out what it is, who I am, and what I needed to look at in this work. So I'll just pass it over to Linda now to share a bit about the BRAID network. And in the spirit of creating a community of learning, we're so happy to have you here. And Linda will talk about BRAID's vision and the work that's going on over at the University of Manitoba. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Laurie. So the BRAID network is really the culmination to this point of the work that I've been doing at the University of Manitoba. About 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, I started to work with Dr. Barry LaValle on various aspects of addressing and updating how we teach Indigenous health within medicine specifically, and where we kept all roads kind of led to the need to address racism. That's what we were hearing from our community members, that this was the number one thing that they wanted future doctors to be well versed in, is to understand the history of colonialism, understand how racism impacts their lives and their health, and also do something to actively disrupt systemic racism in the healthcare system. And so my work from starting to take that on kind of on the side of my desk 10 years ago has now grown into a full-blown, I focused on it for my PhD, and my work now largely focuses on faculty development around becoming anti-racist educators within the health professions. And in doing this work and in learning on the job, one thing that was something that I saw as a strength, and what we were kind of informally developing within medicine, was a community of practice of educators that was learning and growing together in this space. And at the same time, I was also having multiple conversations with colleagues in some of the other health professional programs who had an interest in incorporating more Indigenous health content, in addressing racism and incorporating anti-racism in their approach to teaching and responding specifically to the TRC, but a lot of times didn't know where to even start. And that's where BRAID came in. I applied for a little bit of internal funding to basically build a community of practice across our whole Faculty of Health Sciences. What has developed over the last couple of years has been that I've gotten to work with a couple of wonderful women. Laurie is one of them, and the other I want to acknowledge is Ashley Janis, who's on the call and is behind the scenes advancing our slides. Ashley is a UBC master's student who is working with us, and she's the student project coordinator. The three of us together have been building a variety of activities to support the BRAID network. But as an overall kind of overarching vision, what we try to do in BRAID is to provide education, training, and a sense of community to promote anti-racist practice within the University of Manitoba at the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences. Well, that's what I initially set out to do. And then I discovered very quickly that people outside of the University of Manitoba were interested in our work. So while I still do a lot of the work in BRAID with my colleagues at the University of Manitoba in mind, I'm also really keen to share whatever information is helpful with other groups such as yourself. Next slide, Ashley. And so we've been doing this through creating a structure that is to provide that support for collective learning and developing this interdisciplinary cohort and creating opportunities for people to develop their anti-racism education skills, but also to facilitate discussions with their colleagues to help advance the learning. Next slide. And we have a lot of opportunities to engage with BRAID. It's growing all the time. Things that we're currently doing, we have a drop-in BRAID cafe that we do approximately once a month, which is no agenda, drop in, discuss, bring questions, bring experiences about anti-racism education and experiences to discuss with colleagues in an informal setting. We also have a learning series. This workshop was part of our learning series. It was the first one in our series. And they're usually about 2 hours, so we're condensing it quite a bit today. And on top of that, we also alternate that with an anti-racism reading circle where we do a deep dive and Laurie leads a facilitated discussion around, we pick a curated work collection of anti-racism writings and do an examination and discuss how we can incorporate that into our teaching practice. And then the final thing that I'll mention, which is very Winnipeg specific, but you know, it is something that maybe I'll throw out there as an idea of work that can be replicated somewhere else. Last summer, we developed an anti-racism walking tour, which was a collection of print resources and that matched up to sites around Winnipeg that we hoped people would go and visit the sites and take that opportunity to look at their city around them with an anti-racist, anti-colonial lens to really understand the colonial history that happened on these lands and to see how that has played out and impacted the Indigenous community here locally. And so we've had a lot of good feedback on that, and it was really an interesting project to put together, and I learned a lot in doing it. Next slide, please. And we're going to be making these slides available. These are some of the resources that we've developed that you might find helpful. We have a comprehensive library guide that we house at the University of Manitoba on our website. It's open to anybody, and you'll have access to that link in the resource that's provided along with the slides. We also have a SharePoint website where we share all of our resources that we continue to develop for BRAID. It's housed on the University of Manitoba website, but I'm able to grant access to anybody outside of the U of M who's interested in accessing. And if you have any questions about that, you can just contact us. You'll have all our contact information and we can get you set up. And we're on social media. Right now we're on Instagram and Twitter, and we try to stay fairly active on those. We're better at Instagram, I will say, and that's Ashley's work. She's great at keeping up with social media, and everything that we do, we try to post on social media, so you can follow us there. And I think that's it. And Laurie, back to you.
Right on. Thanks, Linda. It's one thing I've been really impressed with the BRAID network is that it's accessible to anyone and it's free. And that's the limitations where people can fit it in whenever they want. All of our 6 workshops are recorded and available. So thanks for making that free and accessible. So in all of the workshops that we do, this is the outline, the basic outline we follow. And it starts with whose Indigenous land do I live on? Starting with that recognition and thought, and Senator Murray Sinclair says that doing land acknowledgements are like a drop of water on a rock, and repeating them over at every meeting can change the current of denial and the rock hard resistance to that recognition. So we like to say that is it's a good starting place. And I see on the iCON website, Chief Ian Campbell has done a whole session on that. So that's something people can go back and look at. And it helps us to remember, look deeply at what happened and is continually happening on Indigenous land, and to consider what it is that allows settlers to live on Indigenous land. What's required for that to continue to happen and not to be addressed? We know that race matters, and we're all in relationship with Indigenous people and working in anti-racist Indigenous development. I think of myself as always in the process of development as a white settler, thinking about learning about who I am and my identity, and pick that image there of the researcher looking at both through a magnifying glass and a mirror. So looking at closely at the topic of anti-racism, and then in that context, who am I in relationship with what's going on in these inequities? So there's a quote, anti-racism education requires naming the privileges and power that have become largely invisible and normalized by white people in North America, and visible to racialized people who do not benefit from the same privileges and power. And that's from the Anti-Indigenous Racism Training and Culturally Safe Learning Theory, Practice, and Pedagogy by Cheryl Ward, Minomia, and Firestone 2021. So you have that link. And then the thing about remembering that there are always exits and off-ramps. We've been socialized into an aversion and avoidance of speaking to race. So the goal is to create a workplace community of anti-racism practice where we speak up, talk, think about how we are involved in this, and find and build alliances to hold each other accountable, because there's a car wash right outside the door there waiting to wash off any learning, any critical knowledge that you gain from some of these sessions. You walk out the door, and what you see and the workplaces that you learn in are biased by white supremacy. So I'll just say that up front. And the car wash is trying to keep you from sticking from that learning sticking onto you. So hold on tight as you come out the door, and think about how you can continue to learn. So the next slide is also a reminder that we are always under construction. As I was talking, it's a process of development of self and professional. And also we can always be looking at and deconstructing what we see around us, thinking about what we know, why we've been taught or not taught about race and racism. We can do assessments of impact of lack of knowing on the relationships and safety that other people feel when they're with us, or when they're being provided services by people who are not Indigenous or people of color. Also, the vulnerability and shame in anti-racism work. Please don't get stuck there. That can be a process, a natural process of learning about violence and harm that have occurred. And we can use that as a marker of getting into our humanity and working together to join in working in anti-racism. So that discomfort is a part of the process. Of course, we would have some discomfort. There's some shameful things that have happened in our past in Canada and are still happening. So we can look closely and be a part of that and get past those, some of those emotions that can hold people back. And also remember that we have a responsibility living on Indigenous land to look closely and do something about this that can lead to action. So we're going to add to your toolkit and get into the next slide here. So Daryl Wing-Sue is a person I follow quite closely. His work around microaggressions is quite well known. I think he has 3 books out. And this quote I always like to remember is that it's been shown that honest race talk is one of the most powerful means to dispel stereotypes and bias, and to increase racial literacy and critical consciousness about race issues, to decrease fear of differences, to broaden one's horizons, to increase compassion and empathy. So you have this slide as one of the things that we can do, and building anti-racism literacy and terminology is a part of that process. And the 6 workshops that we have, there's always anti-racism literacy pieces built into that. And we're in the process of creating a learning guide with definitions that can help in that process. And the next slide, just really realizing the time is flying. So when we talk about anti-racism, we like to get to the point of Indigenous specific racism and what is different. So we, as educators, as leaders working in health systems, we must know the unique colonial context for Indigenous specific racism and how that continues to impact the unparalleled health inequities that we see in our work. And this painting is done by Kent Monkman in 2017. It's called The Scream. People may be familiar with it, and it depicts the violence of tearing away Indigenous children from their parents' embrace. And I realized that studying and learning about data in that process, that I could learn information, but not connect to those very real impacts on generations of families. So this is not simply information, but the picture really picks up and exposes that the emotion for families at that time. So I think for myself that I'm learning and I'm having an emotional response, but this is not my reality. This is the reality of Indigenous people who continue to live with some of these colonial violence that's still happening today. So I hang on, take a breath, go in, look deeper, think about what can I do with this information and what can I do about it. So today and yesterday and in the weeks ahead, we'll be continuing to learn about the exposure of thousands of grave sites that the IRS has at Indian residential schools that has woken up the world to that reality and the compassion and recognition of what Indigenous people have been reporting for decades. So today we know that the child welfare system is still removing Indigenous children at much higher rates than any other population. The next slide gets into back to Linda to talk about some of these definitions. So again, one of the things that we can do is to continually learn build our anti-racism literacy. So over to you, Linda, for the next.
Sure. Thanks, Laurie. Yeah, and it's so important to understand the unique experience and phenomenon of Indigenous specific racism, particularly in our Canadian colonial context. And it's really something that traces its roots back to the first contact and the history, ongoing history of settler colonialism. And it continues in contemporary times. It continues to act to oppress Indigenous peoples in these lands based on their race, and results in negative stereotyping, which Laurie will talk about, which has been a large part of her work, and drives a lot of the injustices and inequities that are experienced by Indigenous peoples. It's effectively created a structure within our society and our social institutions that perpetuates power imbalances, discrimination at the systemic level, and ultimately results in inequitable outcomes that stem from colonial policies and practices. And it's really, it is something that hides in plain sight. It's the norm, and so much everyday life upholds it. And on to the next one. And I think this is back to you, Laurie, with your thesis work.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, this image, I did a deep dive into 1,500 comments from participants in the Sanyas Indigenous Cultural Safety Training Program. Many of you may be aware of that program. And in that course, there's a stereotyping discussion board where people share their experiences of witnessing or being faced with stereotyping. And then they also answer the question, what was the impact? So these are the top stereotypes that were found in the research. And again, invite you to look at the thesis in deeper depth. But that picture, when I saw that image, I thought, oh, that's the filter of a service provider who is looking through these stereotypes at an Indigenous person when they're accessing health services and not even aware of them, because sometimes they're so insidious that we aren't even aware that they're there, because it's how we've been taught by being led by a biased system. I think of myself growing up and all of the settler glorification and pioneer imagery as a child, consuming the belief that the grandiose belief around whiteness and my white ancestors, learning, being tested on, studying about a biased history, and what that meant by default was that anyone else was a deficit, or there was something wrong. So not even understanding that, so that when I see and learn about some of these stereotypes that are flooded in media still today, the way that Indigenous people are described, and even the way people have been trained in education in providing services in health services. One other piece, just to reference the chapter in White Benevolence that Dr. Lavallee and myself wrote, was about how racism is coached unconsciously into health systems, and the language that's used by that by health providers as maybe preceptors, as people who have power and privilege in the health system. Some of that language is really, we expose that quite clearly in that chapter. It's 15 pages. It's quite easy to read, and highly recommend that as talking about where these terms come up and how they show up in a healthcare encounter and how they impact the Indigenous person accessing healthcare. So it's important as health faculty or educators or leaders to know that stereotypes can impact decision-making. They impact access to health, access to medical care, access to pain medication, the curriculum, education, assessments, policy, and all aspects of education, design and delivery, and the complaint mechanisms. So these stereotypes flood healthcare systems, and we need to be aware of them and hold them in our heart or in our hand before they impact our heart and our actions. So the next slide gets into another definition. And when we're talking about race and racism, and this is the definition with prejudice plus power is the PPP definition of racism, where it requires both prejudice and power. So as a white person, I may face prejudice, I may face discrimination, but it's not racism because my white race is in power. So understanding that some people can feel that they are personally being violated by a person who's accessing healthcare and feeling mistrust, well-warranted, justified mistrust about their access to services in a health system. And that that response is natural. It's well-warranted. So to not take that personally, but to understand that there is a big system that's much bigger than me as an individual, to be able to hold that in place, and then understanding to support access to health and wellness. So just putting that definition out there, because it's not always clear, and it's something to put on the side and to remember that that's a part of what we're seeing and experiencing. And the next one is another definition. And this one is oppression. People know about that, what that means. And again, to have a clear definition will help us in our relationships to understand what that means, that about unwarranted detriments and disadvantages. So what that can feel like, and that feeling of oppression is at the starting place. And, I remember thinking, well, we're going to get to an equal starting place at some point, and then thinking finally of course we won't. Our history has taken care of that. We will never have an equal starting place. Our Canadian history, the history of colonization in Canada has taken care of that. So recognizing that we start here that means that I'm going to do more to recognize and learn and look for those inequities and what I can do to address and support oppression and oppressive stances in the healthcare system. And the next one is, so what do we need to know about ourselves? We need to know who we are. So what do we need to know as what can we do as physicians, educators, and health leaders? So this is a good self-reflection critical point to save that question and do some work on it. Keep coming back to it to address the systemic coaching of Indigenous specific racism in health systems. It's necessary to understand settlers and for settlers to understand themselves. And that's from Dr. Barry Lavallee from a webinar he did for the Indigenous Cultural Safety Collaborative Learning Series. And that'll be in the reference list there. And that was from 2017. So the reference is Lavallee and Mushquash. That's Chris Mushquash. He's another Indigenous educator, making the Indigenous body human one day at a time. And that's on the list. So you'll have that as well. The next slide goes to another exercise that you can take away. We wanted to make sure we had some things that you can take away and do on your own. We only have you for a little bit of time here. And this is something you can do with colleagues, staff, or students, or yourself later on today, is remembering that critical race learning is an important starting place for anyone invested in anti-racism development and a learning journey. And it's necessary to integrate our identity into practice and workplace. And it underlines the point that there's no neutral or equal starting place, and all people are needed in this work. And you may be familiar with this kind of a social location exercise. And this one was adapted from a racialized settler colleague I work with at UVic, and who prefers not to be named. She's so humble. But in this exercise, you can explore how your own social identities affect the way we engage with colleagues and learners. And in order to better understand yourself and your role as an anti-racism advocate, it's helpful to consider the power you have or don't have for Indigenous, Black, or people of color, or other equity denied groups. Some people would used to say equity seeking, but it's a colleague mentioned that they feel denied, and it's flipping that script from being not seeking but being denied, and how they're situated in relationships in the classroom, in meetings, in the boardroom, and in the broader community. So using a lens of social identity wherever we are, and while your approach as a health leader or educator can't be reduced to these simple factors, we need to consider their significance and their complex roles in shaping ourself in relationship and our experiences. The next one is an example here again of this, a way to take that a little bit further, is to take a minute, and you'll have these slides afterwards, or if you want to take a photo right now, what are your points of privilege and oppression? I did this activity and I knew that I would have a lot of privilege, but doing it it was, I had seen it years ago, but doing it again, and I realized that now I'm over 60, so there was one of age and as a woman, but otherwise my social identity markers of privilege were all there. They're not going to change based on race, and some of them will change, but we wanted to provide this as an opportunity for people to see and reflect on the categories, and just even to think about what it feels like as you do this list, as you do this work. It's making explicit some of the realities that are brushed off and not always evident, or provided opportunities to talk about in the workplace or in your relationships within work. So the next slide is back over to Linda and talking about how this all comes together. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Laurie. Yeah, and so we wanted to bring this together. Why are we asking you to do self-location exercises? And it's really about this concept that all oppression, and I would say all oppression and all privilege, is interconnected. And so it's a way to start understanding how all of these forms of oppression intersect. And if you dig beneath the surface, you can see how they can get traced back to whiteness and or colonization at their root. And that's a really important connection to start making, to understand, because really doing anti-racism work is really about understanding the mechanism of oppression and racism, and seeing how these are all act together in an additive way. One thing that, and this is something that in working with students, I usually bring fairly front and center, is that the point of this is not to get into what some authors have called the oppression Olympics, where we start comparing, well, this is what my experience of oppression was, and is that worse than your experience of oppression? Because really, in doing that, that's actually upholding part of the divisive colonial framework that upholds racism, because it pits oppressed groups against each other. And so we're trying to understand all of our oppressions and how they intersect as a way to disrupt pitting us against each other and to find some common ground. So a way to flip that around and to start using this to apply it to your anti-racism work is to look at, how are my experiences and understandings of oppression or privilege related to colonization and the experience of Indigenous peoples? And then you can start making those connections in a real personal way. Next slide, please. And, oh, hang on here, I just have to look at my notes here. Really, the other thing that we want you to do is to particularly look at the community in which you live and work, and to try to work towards understanding the specific systemic violence that has occurred in that community, and how is that contributing and promoting white supremacy, and also continuing to drive the disparities and health inequities of the Indigenous peoples that you might be working with. We also wanted to include this quote by Lati et al. To also remind us to not assume that all experiences of oppression are interchangeable, and that every group's experience of oppression is unique. I would suggest that even extends to Indigenous groups across Canada. We've all experienced colonial oppression, but our individual histories may be different, and so needing to have that specific understanding of the land in which you work and live. Next slide. And I'm going to perhaps just very, very quickly, because I know we're up against the clock here, but we wanted to use this image of the elephant, and the parable of the blind man, blindfolded people feeling different parts of the elephant, that depending on our different experiences and background and social location, we're never going to understand the whole picture if we just continue to only look at our little corner of the world. And so I think with that, I'm going to pass it over to Laurie so that we can, I know you were thinking of jumping ahead, and I'll let you do that.
Okay. Yeah, thanks so much. I think if we hop to maybe number 25, teaching while white, I can briefly say that when we are doing this work, our racial identity matters. When we're sitting in boardrooms, wherever we are, knowing who we are and what we represent is a requirement to being able to earn a seat at talking about race and racism. So we can't go in and say, well, I treat everyone the same. That's actually not helpful. So quickly wanted to make that point, that knowing who we are is a part of the anti-racism work. The next slide gets into the exits and off-ramps, where we maybe have lived in a place, in a space where anything that's challenging, we want to divert or refer over to someone else to work with. So we know that BIPOC teachers, professors, and leaders, and people that are working in health systems trying to push these inequities into the front and center will face and have lived with discrimination and racism throughout their lives and throughout their work. And that's why they're there doing this really difficult work. So that means that anti-racism work for white people like me is a constant professional development requirement, and our socialized aversion to identifying race that we bring to the table is something to consider and to be prepared for. And we've put that chapter link in there. And here's a quote: "If Indigenous specific racism is to end, all staff need to know where it comes from and how it is transmitted, coached, and enforced within systems." And research indicates that colonial power imbalance that white settlers have over Indigenous peoples, combined with normalized dehumanizing stereotypes, are a deadly combination, enforcing the current inequitable relationship. And the next slide is what happens when we don't speak up. I know myself, I probably still will be in places where I'll think this isn't the best time. There's a way and a means to do this. I'll have to strategize how and when, who to collaborate with in addressing or interrupting, but to do something about speaking up and doing something about addressing racism. So we saw in the In Plain Sight report the goal for a speak up culture. So these are things that I've thought about for myself. What if I say the wrong thing? Often I still think of that. And then if I bring it up, people have thought, well, if I bring it up, is that being racist? If I expose it, or how are people going to hear me? And these are other exits where people have said, well, can't we just all get along? Well, there is a massive history here where inequities must be addressed. So it's not really about just getting along, but it's about addressing bigger, broader systemic harms and processes. So, and also the last point there about being targeted, there's a risk for Black, Indigenous, people of color to address and interrupt racism. So for white settlers to collaborate and to learn what, when, and how to speak up and what to do is a part of this, this learning process. And the next slide we'll just briefly touch on is the process that we've had for learning has begun with cultural awareness, then cultural sensitivity, cultural competency. And our goal at the end with equitable healthcare shows that some of these have been not as helpful, little pieces along the way, but we're getting now to the goal of cultural safety and anti-racism education. So the first place, learning about cultural awareness and cultural sensitivity, that can be, the risk there is that differences are seen as cultural rather than systemic and powerfully enforced by systems. And then cultural competency are some of the nuts and bolts around practical applications around equity, diversity, and inclusion in workplaces. And then moving on up the scale, we want to get to the interpersonal and structural interventions where people have places and means to do reporting, where to learn, and are in places to interrupt and identify racism as it comes up. The next one is another one around what you can do. Learn more about Indigenous specific racism. These are some of the specific steps and initiatives that you can take to integrate anti-racism into your practice. And there are many great resources, as Linda mentioned, that the BRAID has a resource site. I know that Vancouver Coastal Health has a resource site, and we'll be sending you a page full, chock full of resources. So we invite you to the next BRAID reading circle, where we'll be unpacking White Supremacy and Me by Lala F. Syed. And that's learning is an ongoing process. That book is it's called About Combating Racism, Changing the World and Becoming a Good Ancestor. And please do feel free to share topics and resources that you have with us. And just one last one about responding and reminders. The complaint mechanisms are subject to individual and systemic bias. Remember, we mentioned that. So along the way that whoever's working in that system, whoever's working in HR or taking complaints, are susceptible to stereotypes and to stereotype triggers. So recognizing that that is a part. So some of the work that we've done with simulation at UBC and Vancouver Island Health Authority with their simulation station is doing a filter. You know, is our stereotypes, have stereotypes been enacted whenever there's an incident of harm, or looking at healthcare for an Indigenous person or a person of color? Are our stereotypes checked? Are we watching for them to see that they're not going to keep this person from having adequate pain management, et cetera? And also a reminder that policies don't change workplace culture, people do, and that this is relational work. So all of us have a role and a place and a space in that. And next one, Linda, I'll pass it back to you for the next icon. Lead into
Yes.
that. So
Yeah.
here we go.
Thanks, Laurie. So yeah, exactly. And go. The next icon workshop, and we'll try to work on the timing in our slides better. We're just so excited about always including more. Like I had said at the beginning, this was originally 2 hours, and it's always hard to know where to cut. But next time, the next jam-packed workshop that we'll be doing with you is getting in kind of to the next stage of becoming an anti-racist practitioner, which is looking at what does it mean to be an ally and who says so. And so we're going to be unpacking a lot that's contained within that allyship terminology, including performativity, solidarity, white saviorism, all this and more. And I think with that, we have some references to share in our slides that you'll be getting this deck. And I think that's it.
Wow. Excellent. Linda and Laurie, thank you so much. So much content, and you really have filtered it to really a very digestible bites. Appreciate that a lot. We have quite a few comments and questions, so I can't wait to do that. I really want to thank the audience for the active thinking through. And for those who may have to leave right now, there's a quick evaluation. If you can leave maybe just a few comments on the evaluation for us, that'll be amazing. And for those who may leave and want to leave comments here, I will make sure I'll ask your questions so that it will be in the recording. So the first comment was back to 1239. Valeria have asked and really comment. The BRAID, your network is excellent activities, should be very interested in learning more about. And so again, you have stressed how to join and also social media, which is great. She also reflect on whether Vancouver Coastal Health would have similar activities. And maybe I'll extend that question to you, Linda and Laurie. How do organizations like VCH or other organizations join with you so that we can continue to learn from your network? Welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I had said, and I didn't get a chance to speak to it too much, but we've been taking a very inclusive approach with BRAID. We don't turn anybody away. Our philosophy is the more the merrier. If you're interested in doing this work and you think that what we're doing at BRAID can help and support you doing that work, we welcome you to join. We have an email address, and maybe I'll get Ashley to pop it in the chat because I don't want to get it wrong. It's Ashley runs the email for us, and if you want to get connected to our SharePoint site, she can help you through that email to get connected, and then you'll see all of our resources fully through the SharePoint, and also she can add you to our email distribution list so that you can stay absolutely current on all the things that we are doing. We actually just had a meeting yesterday. We're talking about exciting things that we're thinking about doing for the future, including some panels examining some current emerging topics in anti-racism, and perhaps a podcast. I'm trying to get convinced that I am able to host a podcast. I'm still dealing with my own personal comfort with that, but I feel like there's a lot of interest in that. So stay tuned. But yes, absolutely join us. Laurie, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Well, I just am so thrilled with Braid for that reason of being open door and free, because there's so many places that are protectionist around information, and this, I can't say underline how much I know for myself this information is needed everywhere, and we want to bring everyone along in this learning journey wherever they are, offering health or wellness in Manitoba, in Ontario, in BC, I see at Vancouver Coastal Health there's a huge initiative. The leadership there is fundamentally 100% behind that kind of growth and learning, and all of the health authorities are intent in creating change. So let's fuel each other and keep doing the work together. It's everyone's work, and I appreciate being a small part of that.
Immediately with our very exciting stuff that you're doing, we love to, in our VCH iCON steering committee, we'd love to invite you to join us and teach us how to move that forward. The next comment from Matt at 12:50. What are the top 3 to 5 bedside skills that we should practice in the hospital or emergency department, as well as in community primary care? What are your thoughts on that? Welcome.
Well, number one, it's listening, and by that, and I know that as healthcare professionals, we are trained to listen, but sometimes we're trained to listen and want patients to share their stories in a particular way that meets our needs, and oftentimes that doesn't work for a lot of patients, Indigenous or non-Indigenous, and sometimes information is shared or not shared when, everybody kind of knows when, you're sharing and someone's not being receptive. And so, taking that moment to get into that space of, really being engaged, I think is number one. And that's just, I think, across the board. I don't know if that's necessarily an anti-racist thing. I think that's just effective healthcare practice. And the other thing is, and these are, I realize these are simple things to say, but like really time consuming. But understanding the context of our patients is hugely important. And, understanding kind of the histories and what, might be barriers based on the history of a community of why there may be a lack of trust, so that you understand that and, and can, I think, can speak to that. And then the third thing I'll say that's related to that is becoming trauma informed in your practice. And I'm not an expert in teaching about trauma informed care, but there are a lot of resources and more all the time about how to understand trauma in all forms, but specifically for Indigenous patients. What does it mean for generations of Indigenous people having experienced historic intergenerational trauma, which is not something we had a chance to talk about today, but certainly that's very connected to colonialism. And what does that mean? What does that look like if I'm approaching patients in this trauma-informed way? Now, this is the whole workshop in itself, and probably could be like a lifetime long course, to be honest. But I'll point you to, and I'm trying to remember the name of the author. There is this book, it's called Decolonizing Trauma Work. And I believe the author is Renee Linklater. And it's an excellent resource on specifically approaching trauma-informed care from this perspective of understanding the Indigenous context. So off the top of my head, those are 3 things that are not simple. all very big things. But Laurie, do you have any thoughts to add to that?
Oh, I know for myself, I had to learn who I am and what I represent when I'm in that context, because I can have done all this work and that person doesn't know who I am or my level of cultural safety acknowledgement. So there's a new theory coming out for trauma. It's persistent dehumanizing trauma. And that's about racism. And I mentioned Tracy Underwood at UVic is doing that for her PhD in child and youth care. So we're working on a new theory to look at, instead of PTSD for Indigenous peoples, to recognize that these are, so the trauma construct isn't just, wasn't one time, there's no post about dehumanizing racism. It's daily, layered, can pop up in any place, any space at any time. So there, her thesis will have some really good information on that. So being up to date and knowing the theoretical foundations of what you understand in health services. I know for myself, critical race theory was fundamentally important and vital in learning about who I am and what I bring into that bedside incident or encounter.
Excellent, thank you. We go to 12:52 now. At that point, Laurie, you're giving that slide about filters, and that was a very impactful one. Kim suggests that another filter might be special treatments. Quote.
Yes, that's in there. That's I didn't put them all up there, but there. Dr. Lavallee would say that there is a stereotype for every behavior that an Indigenous person has. I remember thinking when I was doing that research that I would know them all, and then realized he said that they are, any behavior that an Indigenous person has will be seen through stereotypes. So they are like Ibram Kendi would say, like, well, we wouldn't use a Cadillac anymore, maybe we'd say a Prius, but there's a new version every year. So whatever is coming up, whatever's happening, the interpretation of the other is necessary to create a stereotype or an othering lens to keep our validation of those inequities. Because if we don't, then we have to look at who are we in this. If we don't other, then we're looking at this inequitable relationship and recognizing and acknowledging our responsibility and our accountability within that, creating that inequitable position. So yeah, thanks for recognizing that the special treatment, which really, I flip that on its head and say, when we look at the land extraction and resources that settler society has taken, who's getting the special treatment and who's getting the free ride? You know, if we can turn that around and look at it that way. Thanks.
Jody also made
I just want to add one thing. Oh, sorry. Can I just add one thing to that? I think that's such an excellent point with the stereotyping and how it functions, and to bring that kind of into the clinical scenario, how, you know, that really, if we see the person in stereotype, then we don't have to actually look at our own way that we're, you know, our interactions might be harmful. And, you know, I have a friend who's a physician who always, one of her pet peeves, she's an Indigenous physician, is when Indigenous patients are labeled bad historians. And she always like flips that around and says, like, as long as we stick with that stereotype of the bad historian, we don't have to look at how we're a bad history taker. I'll just leave it on that.
Wow, a great point. Jody also made an insightful point about the filters, and she was thinking that, you know, there are filters in professions, filter in the education, filters in classes. In that particular chapter you talked to Laurie or Linda in this area, is it helpful to think about them in different types of filter and different kind of contexts, professional, educational classes? And do you have some more insights on that particular point?
Yeah, you can put on an Indigenous cultural safety and an Indigenous anti-racism filter to hold those back, because they're going to come up. Know them, know that they're there, watch for them, identify how they'll influence how you see that person, and then protect your heart and your actions from enacting those triggering stereotypes. They will show up. And Linda, you probably have some more to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, and I've heard this from my colleagues and the people I talk to in my study. And like I was saying, I do a lot of work in faculty development. And one thing that I've heard is that as you engage in anti-racism work, you do this self-location, this self-reflective work that we started to talk to you about today, you start to see racism everywhere. And it almost feels like there's more racism, but in fact, it was always there. It's just that now you have the ability to see it. And then when you have the ability to see it, you have that responsibility to interrupt, right, and to address it. And so, yeah, I think it's an interesting way to look at this as filters, as lenses, that they're you know, they can have these negative effects, but then when you can counteract it by, you know, like by having these lenses put on that allow you to see what's in front of you, you can start to make those changes and disrupt that.
Excellent. We have about 3 or 4 more questions. We have 5 minutes. I think we can make it. So let me right away set Joe at 12:55. Really appreciate you sharing about reverse racism. So that was very insightful. If you want to comment now, that's great. If you want to embed it into your next presentation next time, that'll be fantastic. Any comment on reverse racism that you'd like to add?
There's a really good YouTube. Who is it, Linda? Do you remember? South Asian man. It's brilliant. It's really quick, easy. We'll pop it in maybe if we find it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. We'll definitely, we could address it in the next one. I think that's yeah, I think that we can address it there. It's a big topic.
It is. Thank you. Jay Tabatabe, sorry, I may have mispronounced you. I apologize. At 12:57. How can individual awareness change the structural, constitutional, social, and developmental racism in our society? Welcome thoughts there.
Yeah, well, that's a big question, but I always say, you know, systems are made of people. And so we have to start somewhere. We have to start in our sphere of influence. So if it's starting with us and a few of our colleagues, you know, I'm personally amazed by how much change can happen when even a small contingent of people, you know, like even 2 or 3, start to take on this work and to start asking questions that disrupt the status quo. And so, yeah, systems are huge and difficult to change. It can be overwhelming. It can be burnout is very easy in this type of work, which is why it's so important to stay connected to colleagues and to talk things through. But you know, I really do believe that we have to start small. I mean, this is kind of the story of braid. I thought 5 people were going to come to braid things, and I thought that'll be fine. It'll be 5 more than were here yesterday, and then, you know, but things grow, and you know. So, Laurie, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, you're. I can relate to that myself. That networking, as we said, this is relational work. If you're thinking about this and it's something you want to learn more about, guaranteed there's a whole bunch more people around you, and making the time, consistent efforts, like with some of the work we're doing in Manitoba, 1 hour a week, connecting and moving an idea ahead. And we got a huge grant to do the work. So keeping on it weekly, and the Braid Cafe, having a cafe where people can process information. So keep it on the burner, because that car wash is there. It's real. It's trying to wash that off. So keeping dedicated time and asking for that time in your workplace and space, because this is on the agenda. It's probably maybe the top 3 items for every health authority across Canada. So you can use the traction, you can use the TRC, Missing Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report, calls to action. There's traction all over this stuff. So use it, lobby for it, keep it on your radar, keep it in your discussions, and put a sticky. I used to turn every page of my day timer and cultural safety, how am I bringing that into the discussion? I kind of get to be the squeaky wheel. People just know that's what I'm going to say. So, but you can do that too, and push those systems.
Thank you so much. We have 1 minute left, so I have I have several questions, but I'm going to park this one and invite you all back February 10th, because Linda and Laurie will be there again. This question is from Paul. I've come across some who said to Indigenous people just need to try harder. They have shared that these individuals said that there are resources for them and they're using it inefficiently. How can I explain that this is not the case? I think that's such a key question. Thank you, Paul, for asking it. I don't think we have time to address it, but I invite you, Linda and Laurie, to address that question next time, February 10th. Again, I want to, on behalf of everyone, Linda and Laurie, I see so many comments there thanking you for excellent, impactful presentation. Thank you so much. I want to thank Ministry of Health, VCH, Indigenous Health, VPSA, and also First Nations Health Authority, together with us at UBC, organizing these rounds. Thank you so much, everyone. We look forward to seeing you February 10th. And Laurie and Linda, we look forward to welcoming you back. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Read the thesis. The question is answered in there.
There you go. And please fill out the evaluation, everyone. Thank you.